Today is December 2nd. It's the 337th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. On this day in 1823, President James Monroe gives his 7th State of the Union address to Congress, during which he proclaims what will years later be referred to as the Monroe Doctrine, quote, that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. The essence of what Monroe outlines on this day is that any attempts to introduce further European influence into the New World is to be considered as dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. Monroe makes it clear that Europe is expected to stay out of American affairs, and in return, the United States will not interfere in European wars or internal affairs. Monroe's pronouncement comes after the wrap-up of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. France and Spain have been at each other's throats. Napoleon sold off a huge portion of France's holdings in the New World in the Louisiana Purchase in order to finance his wars in Europe. And while the Spanish Empire is broken up at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and many of the Spanish colonies in the New World are in rebellion, Spain still has a strong foothold in the Americas. In 1819, the U.S. purchases Florida from Spain. Once that treaty is ratified, President Monroe recognizes the republics of Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico in 1822. The next year, in 1823, France and Spain start conspiring to recolonize the newly declared South American republics, and Russia begins exerting influence in Mexico. Great Britain wants to band together with the United States to confront the Spanish and the French. And there's some in Monroe's cabinet who think that that's the best course of action. But Monroe considers the counsel of his Secretary of State and decides on a different tack that still meets British interests, planting the seeds for the special relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain. And really, it's Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who authors the policy James Monroe announces on this day in 1823, which by 1850 is referred to as the Monroe Doctrine. That is the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for the next 100 years. Puyi is only 2 years old when he becomes Emperor Zhuotong of China, the 10th ruler of the Manchu dynasty. We talked about Puyi earlier in the year, but I just can't pass up this opportunity to revisit him. Puyi is born in 1906 in the Forbidden City, the estate of the Imperial Palace in Beijing. When the reigning emperor dies without an heir, Puyi is chosen as his successor by the Empress Dowager in 1908. Still a toddler, he screams and cries when the eunuchs pick him up to take him to his coronation. His father tries to calm him and carries him into the Hall of Supreme Harmony for the ceremony. Puyi still crying his little eyes out. It'll be over soon, his father tells him. And it is. Following the Xinhai Revolution, Puyi is forced to abdicate the throne in 1912 when he's 6 years old. After his abdication, he's given the name Henry by his English language tutor Reginald Johnston. Henry Puyi lives in isolation in the Forbidden City, the luxurious palace that is his prison until his late teens when he's forced into exile, fleeing Beijing in 1924. In exile, he lives the life of a wealthy playboy. In the 1930s, the Japanese install him as ruler of the puppet state Manchukuo, but he's emperor in name only. He's still surrounded by the coterie of servants who take care of his every need, even his most basic functions, such as brushing his teeth and tying his shoes. He has servants who do that for him. After the end of World War II, he's captured by the Soviets and lives in Russia, in fear of being sent back to a post-war communist China, certain that he will be executed upon his return for his collusion with the Japanese enemy during the war. Instead, when he is sent back to China in 1950, he's not executed, but spends 9 years in jail, undergoing incessant re-education and Maoist indoctrination to turn the former Chinese emperor into a model Maoist citizen. He also learns how to brush his own teeth and dress himself. He's released in 1959, assigned a job at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, and lives in a modest house. Pu Yi, who becomes ruler of the Qing Empire at the age of 2 on this day in 1908, passes away a humble gardener at the age of 61 in 1967. There are 29 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. On this day in 1982, Barney Clark becomes the first recipient of a permanent artificial heart. Clark doesn't expect to live more than a few days with his artificial heart, and doctors think that's optimistic. But he survives for 112 days, tethered by tubes to an external pneumatic compressor the size of a washing machine. He suffers infections, confusion, and at times asks to be allowed to die. But he undergoes the surgery on this day for the benefit of medical science. The modern version of the Jarvik 7 implanted in Barney Clark on this day in 1982 has served as a bridge to heart transplant for more than 1,300 people since then. So if you're still listening, turn on your heart light. That's terrible. Talk to you tomorrow.